Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me in Pecos Hall?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. I saw a thumbs up as well, so thank you. Appreciate it. My name is Gerasimus Rosados. I am the acting director for the Oil Conservation Division. I'm also the acting chair for the Oil Conservation Commission. Today is April the 22nd. We are in our continuation for the consolidated cases by Goodnight Midstream and Empire, New Mexico. This is a hearing that we are continuing, an evidentiary hearing. This is for case numbers 24123. 23614 through 17, case number 23775, and also case numbers 24018 through 24020 and 24025. Before I transfer it over to the hearings officer, Mr. Hearing Officer, I wanted to bring up a scheduling issue that we're going to have for Friday. We do need to finish kind of early. I and the actual other two commissioners do have to be done by 3 p.m. So if we could wrap it up by 2:45 on Friday, at the pace we're going, where we're going to need that third week that we had planned in May. So obviously things will probably go out through to then. So if we can make sure that we're done by 2:45 on Friday, that way we can accommodate Commissioner Ampoma, Acting Commissioner Lamkin, and my schedule as well.
All right, perfect. Chairman Rosatos, I'll be sure to set the duck for 2:45.
Excellent. I appreciate that. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and this kind of is what I reiterated yesterday, and I have reiterated this multiple times in this setting. Things are getting heated, people, and we need decorum. Whether it's witness responding to attorneys, attorneys responding to witnesses, witness responding to commissioners, commissioners responding to the witnesses. We need decorum in here. The hearing officer is purposely set here to make sure that things are functioning appropriately. We need to give him all due respect. If there are objections, we stop dead in our tracks. Do not try to answer. Let the objection be heard. Let the objection be ruled upon. Then a statement can be made. This is normal etiquette. If this was a district court, some of these shenanigans would not have been accepted. And we all know this. So witnesses, make sure that you're following with decorum. Attorneys, make sure you have the decorum and the respect for the hearing officer. And everybody, make sure that this is a respectful setting. I have said this multiple times, and I'm actually kind of getting tired of saying it. So please make sure that you're following through with this. And this is for everybody. This disrespect is not going to be tolerated. So please make sure that you continue it. And I will interject again and again. And if we have to shut it down, we will shut it down for the day. But it'll be because of your guys' respect. So please make sure that you're following through with this. I'm off my soapbox, Mr. Hearing Officer. I transfer it over back to you.
Okay, and I'll try and, I know some of this is inadvertent. It happens when witnesses understand what the question's going to be and lawyers want to ignore the answer and move on to the next question. So I understand how that works. It's not always intentional, and so I'll try and keep a closer eye out for that. Before we proceed, let me just make sure we have a court reporter online and we're on the record. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. We're on the record.
Okay, great.
And Mr. Hearing Officer, I just wanted to add, Mr. Chandler will also be joining us via Teams again today and for the rest of the week.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Rosados. Okay. I don't see a witness. Where is our witness, Mr. Rankin?
So, Mr. Hearing Officer, good morning. Adam Rankin with Holland Hart, appearing for Goodnight Midstream in this case. As we broke for the day yesterday, Mr. Davidson had completed his cross-examination by the parties and the commission, and the question was whether or not Goodnight was going to bring him back for a redirect. And upon evaluating the questions pending or that had been addressed, we've decided not to bring Dr. Davidson back for redirect. So with that, Mr. Hearing Officer, we would ask that he be excused.
Okay, I appreciate that. I mean, I didn't mean to be flip yesterday at the end of the day when I suggested that he had said everything he possibly could have on the subject.
Yeah.
I think he has and did, so I appreciate the judgment call. I do see him in the back. I do see your witness and Dr. Davidson in the back of the room now.
He's here. And on that point, Mr. Hearing Officer, if the commissioners have any additional questions for Dr. Davidson before we move on, we're happy to allow them to ask additional questions of Dr. Davidson before we do so. One point of order that I do want to just point out, Commissioner Lampkin did ask a question about whether Dr. Davidson had additional analyses reflecting his petrophysical interpretation. I can just point those out to Mr. Lampkin, Commissioner Lampkin, and he can identify them in the record if that's acceptable. Dr. Davidson did include additional petrophysical analyses in his direct testimony attached as Exhibit B, and those are all the there's, I believe, total of 7 EMSU wells and 1 of Goodnight Midstream's injection wells within the unit. And then in his rebuttal testimony, Exhibit D7 has an additional saltwater disposal well operated by Goodnight. So I think there's a total of 9 petrophysical analyses included in his direct testimony and in his rebuttal testimony.
Mr. Lampkin, is that helpful to you?
That is. Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right. To follow up on Mr. Rankin's offer, do either of you gentlemen have additional questions, or you, Chairman Rosatos, for Dr. Davidson?
I'll start off. I do not.
No, I do not.
I don't either.
All right, great. Before we move on to your next witness, overnight I was thinking about this, and for the record, as well as for the benefit of the parties, it was late in the afternoon. My brain was tired. I have to listen to every question throughout the day. So toward the end of the day, this issue came up with Dr. Davidson's opinion in connection with Mr. Moander's cross-examination. And I just want, for the record and for the benefit of the parties, although you all are sophisticated players, so this is more for the record than anything else, but I wanted to make sure that my ruling was clear on that. I did not actually grant Mr. Moander's motion to exclude that testimony. If that testimony were presented in a court of law, it likely would have been excluded, because only expert witnesses can offer opinion testimony. It's beside the point, really, that this was an undisclosed opinion, because it was a question that was asked and answered. But the point is, it was an opinion that only an expert could offer. And Dr. Davidson explained that he was not an expert in that subject matter. So in a court of law, that testimony would have been excluded, and a jury would have been instructed to disregard the testimony. Of course, this is not a court of law, and the rules of evidence do not technically and strictly apply. They're just for guidance here. So, and you know, that's for a good reason. I mean, this particular setting exemplifies the reason that there's a relaxed standard. We're not here with a jury of unsophisticated laypersons listening to sophisticated experts, where there's a risk of being misled. Not that I'm suggesting that Dr. Davidson was in any way attempting to do that, but the risk is not present in a situation where you have sophisticated fact finders that are experts in their own right, either in the specific field or in a closely related field. The risk is simply not there. So those were the bases for my decision to not grant Mr. Moander's motion, and simply allow the commission, under the guidance of Mr. Chandler, to give that opinion such weight, if any, that they thought it might deserve. All right. anyway, that said, Mr. Rankin, who is your next witness?
Mr. Hearing Officer, our next witness I'd like to call to the stand is Mr. William Knights.
William Knight,
Knights with an S on the end.
Knights.
Mhm.
I've seen you in the back of the room for a long time, Mr. Knights. Good to put a face to a name. If you please raise your right hand. You swear and affirm the testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
Yes, I do.
All right, Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. Mr. Knights, will you please state your name for the record?
William J. Knights,
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
Netherlands Sewell and Associates, and I'm a senior technical advisor, vice president.
And what is your role in that capacity with Netherlands Sewell?
Basically due diligence on financial transactions, SEC reporting, signing reserve reports, and evaluating financial transactions.
And you do that based on a geologic analysis, is that right?
Yes, I'm primarily a geologist, but I've been there 35 years and worked with engineers closely for that entire time.
Now, in this case, have you previously testified before the commission?
No, I have not.
Are you seeking to be qualified as an expert in petroleum geology?
I don't like to. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, okay. And is your curriculum vitae or your resume attached as an Appendix A to your direct written testimony?
Yes, it is.
Because you haven't yet testified before the commission, Mr. Knights, and just to give a little background for the commission to understand your experience, will you just give a brief summary of your education first?
Master's degree in geology from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, and basically experience in the industry since 1983.
So I'll move on to your experience now. So from the time, when did you obtain your master's degree from TCU?
1983.
1983. And so then I'm going to ask with respect specifically to your experience around the Central Basin Platform and the Permian Basin, if you would just give us a brief summary of your experience as a petroleum geologist, in particular as it relates to conducting geologic evaluations and reserves assessments for fields in and around the Central Basin Platform.
I think the largest project I worked on was the Altura acquisition, which was the acquisition of BP and Shell's CO2 projects on the Central Basin Platform at title 23 fields, including the Hobbs North, South, Seminole, Wasson, Goldsmith. I think those fields were mentioned in this hearing, and then 18 other fields.
All around the Central Basin Platform?
All in the Central Basin Platform and CO2 projects.
Okay. And in your role, what exactly were you tasked with doing as part of your job responsibility in that?
It was basically due diligence, screening the oil in place, recovery factors, things that go into the reservoir model, things that influence the financial transaction. A lot of it had to do with depth volume curves, where the oil in place is, and reviewing the geologic inputs to the models.
Okay. So do you have experience evaluating ROZ projects?
Every oil project I have has a component of ROZ.
And as to this case, what were you asked to do in this case?
Review the geology, specifically relating to oil in place, and then also in the communication between the injection zone and the shallower reservoirs.
And as part of that assessment, were you asked to evaluate whether or not there's any potential communication between Goodnight's injection disposal zone and the overlying zones within the EMSU?
Yes, that was part of my task.
Okay. And have you conducted, therefore, a geologic study of the history of oil and water production in and around the EMSU?
Yes, I have.
And that would be both from the Grayburg and the San Andres formations?
Correct.
Okay. And did your analysis also include a determination of whether there's any potentially economically recoverable hydrocarbons in an ROZ within the EMSU?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you look at to come to your opinions?
All the data provided by Empire, Goodnight, and some individual research, as I always do, through all the public data and literature.
And so you looked at data that was provided by Empire as part of this case,
Yes,
and that data that was provided by Goodnight as part of this case?
correct.
And did you also conduct your own independent investigation looking through public records?
Correct. Yes.
And as a result of your analysis, did you prepare written direct rebuttal and surrebuttal testimony and exhibits that are marked as Exhibit E that provide your opinions and analyses?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, before I'm going further, you did prepare a revised direct testimony that was filed with the commission, correct?
Yes, I did.
Will you let us know what it was that you revised in that direct testimony?
It was a mathematical error in the calculation of hydrocarbon pore volume.
And what was the error there?
The intervals were based on half foot, and I summed them up instead of taking the 0.5 foot. So it was a significant mathematical error that we corrected.
Okay. So in addition to the mathematical error, was there another revision that you made in your direct testimony?
Yes, I changed a cutoff, which changed some numbers to more reflect the 20% cutoff that Meltzer and Trentham have defined as the ROZ.
So originally you had used 30% as your cutoff.
Yes.
Can you explain why it is that you initially used 30% and why you revised it to 20%? Why you originally used 30% and why you revised it to 20%?
Generally, I like to use a higher cutoff to kind of get a higher quality rock, an idea, kind of a sensitivity analysis. But then I realized that in this setting, being more conforming to all the other processes makes it easier to relate one oil in place to the other.
Okay. And so that was based on the testimony of Dr. Melzer, or Dr. Trentham and Mr. Melzer, correct?
Yes, correct.
Now, you also prepared a revised surrebuttal testimony that was in response to Ops Geologic's rebuttal testimony that was filed with the commission, correct?
Correct.
What were the revisions that you made on that revised surrebuttal?
There's a 16,000 foot, I think 16,000 number that should have been 19,000. And so just for correctness, I updated that.
That was the only correction you made to that revised testimony?
Correct.
Okay. Were there exhibits and figures included in your revised direct rebuttal and revised surrebuttal testimony prepared by you or compiled under your direction and supervision?
Yes.
Any corrections, any additional corrections or changes to the testimony, figures, or exhibits that were filed with the commission?
No.
Do you adopt the testimony in the self-affirmed direct written rebuttal and revised surrebuttal testimony that's marked as Exhibit E as your sworn testimony today?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I would tender Mr. Knights as an expert witness in petroleum geology.
Any objection from Empire?
Without objection.
OCD,
No objection.
Rice,
No objection.
Pilot,
No objection.
you'll be so recognized.
Mr. Hearing Officer, at this time move the admission of Mr. Knight's revised direct testimony, his rebuttal testimony, and revised surrebuttal testimony, and his attached exhibits and figures that are all marked as Exhibit E.
Right. Any objection, Empire?
Without objection.
OCD,
No objection.
Rice,
No objection.
Pilot,
No objection.
they'll be admitted.
Mr. Knights, have you been present for, or did you listen to the summary testimony, the cross-examination and redirect testimony provided by all the witnesses that were presented during the first and second week of the testimony in this proceeding?
Yes.
And you were here for the testimony yesterday, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And did you prepare summary slides reflecting your up-to-date opinions based upon observing the testimony, the questions, and the redirect over the course of this proceeding?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, Mr. Knights, and we'll walk through your slides. I'll ask you a question to prompt, and if you would just explain at high level the key takeaways, how each of these slides reflect your summary opinions for the benefit of the commission. So this first slide, number one, if you would just explain what the star is and why this is significant in terms of your overall analysis.
Yeah, it's kind of a big picture of the St. Andrews and Grayburg fields in the Central Basin Platform in New Mexico, and basically shows that south of the EMSU, there's very little production.
And the yellow star indicates where the EMSU or MSU is located.
Correct.
Okay. How does this next slide here reflect on the previous slide and explain what this shows with respect to the San Andres?
Well, the way the oil got into the San Andres is typically industry standard coming from the Wolfcamp. So it's very complicated migration pathways as the oil migrates into the San Andres and the Grayburg and the rest of the Central Basin Platform. The thing that's important about this is that each of these occurrences is unique and very difficult to use any one field as an analogy for another directly.
And this next slide, if you would just explain how this particular slide it reflects upon what you just stated about, in your opinion, the unique nature of each of these San Andres accumulations.
Yeah, since this trial does emphasize the San Andres, I just broke out the fields that were San Andres by the in the public data, showing those fields, basically showing that the east flank of the Central Basin Platform has a high concentration of oil fields that have an indication of that as a major migration pathway, and much fewer fields on the west flank where the EMSU is located, showing that that was a less of a major migration pathway.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I'm hearing some background noise and I'm wondering if it's distracting me and it may be distracting Mr. Knights and maybe others in the room. Maybe we can figure out where that's coming from before we go further.
I'm not hearing it, but my hearing's not very good.
Ms. Apodaca, is it possible to determine if there's somebody whose microphone is not muted?
It almost sounds like somebody's speakers are on their laptop or their phone if they're logged into the meeting.
Are you still hearing it, Mr. Rank?
I'm not hearing it right now based on your vocalization, so I think we're probably okay.
I turned off my phone just in case.
Good idea.
All right. All right. Whoever the culprit was, you don't need to speak up.
So, Mr. Knights, I think I apologize because I was being distracted by the sound of that reverberation or echo. But maybe just quickly summarize what you just said for my benefit, if not anybody else's. But explain how this slide is relevant to what you just discussed about the unique accumulations in the San Andres across the basin.
Well, this is restricted to the San Andres, and it basically shows that the eastern part of the Central Basin Platform is a major migration pathway with all the fields developed and a tremendous amount of oil, and that the western side of the Central Basin Platform was a less major migration pathway for oil.
And have you indicated here the location of the MSU with the red star, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And that's on the margin of the western margin of the Central Basin Platform, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Moving on to the next slide here, I think this is sort of a general depiction of something we've seen many times already, but if you would just at a very high level explain how this relates to what the previous three slides we just discussed.
Well, this is Trentham Messel and Elter's model on those migration pathways that show the Artesia pathway on the western flank of the Central Basin Platform and additional migration pathways on the east. So the migration of fluid from the west to the east, and then from the north to the south. And the lower picture shows the actual pathway of the Artesia extending down south, and even in this diagram, going all the way to the end of the eastern part of the Central Basin Platform in the Yates Field.
What does this tell you about the size and interconnectedness of the San Andres across this large region?
Well, this implies that it's a very, very large aquifer that has a tremendous pathways for fluid migration. I think, yeah.
And what is, and tell me just so I understand for the benefit of the commission, structurally, as you go south, what is the relationship structurally as you go from the MSU unit to the south along the migration pathway or that interconnected pathway?
Well, the EMSU is probably on a structural high, and it goes down as you go to the south. When you go further south to the Yates, it gets very structurally high. And as you go to the west, to the east, it also goes down dip.
Now, zooming in a little bit here, explain what this shows with respect to the specific accumulations of oil in the San Andreas within the central basin, across the Central Basin Platform, and with the significance of this chart that you've got here.
Yeah, so on the far left, I have the EMSU. In yellow is the Grayberg production. So that's where all the production is. The yellow bars below that are the water supply wells that are all in the deeper part of the San Andreas. But I was trying to get a regional picture of what the San Andreas looks like from a standpoint. So when you go to the north to the South Hob Fields, the dark lines that are on these are the top and base of the Grayberg from public data, and just kind of a quick analysis. And the colored ones are producing intervals that have been perfed in that field. And so what you see as you move to the north and to the west, that there's different stratigraphic intervals that are charged with oil in each of these relative to the public Grayberg tops. But kind of pointing out that each of these accumulation is probably unique migration pathways and would be difficult to use as an analogy, a direct analogy for the EMSU.
You said north to the west, but do you mean north to the east?
North to the east.
Yep.
Apologize.
And is this reflective, in your opinion, Mr. Knights, of the unique migration pathways within and across the San Andreas for oil?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Looking at this next slide, I think you're zooming in here to the EMSU unit itself. Would you explain what this shows and how it relates to what we're discussing about the migration pathways of oil across the Central Basin Platform in the San Andreas?
Correct. This was a diagram I made up early in the analysis of just trying to get my bearing on where things were. The green wells on the left are the water supply wells that produce no oil, and you can see that the upper perf in the 458 is at negative 500 feet. So just a quick look says that's pretty much an aquifer. The actual producing interval in the EMSU has a original oil water contact between negative 325 or negative 350. On this diagram, I put 350 as the producing oil water contact, which is in my testimony. All the wells that penetrated below the producing oil water contact and tested oil are highlighted on this. The other thing that's highlighted on this are in the red squares were our original 8 wells that we did petrophysical analysis that Jim Davidson had replied. All the wells in orange on the right are water disposal wells, indicating that to me that everything below negative 500 is an aquifer and used for either water supply or water disposal. And the other thing to mention on this slide is when I go through my analysis, there is a lot of discussion about San Andreas nomenclature. I never want to get into that quagmire. So I just use my oil in place analysis was based on TBD subsea depths. And those are the 3 intervals that I've identified. The interval between 350 feet, the producing oil water contact, and the highest water supply well is at 500. I call that interval a potential ROZ. And the other big scoping picture is that, of the 340, 380 million barrels of water that have been produced below the oil water contact, there's only been 55 barrels of oil produced in all of the tests. So that comes out to a water ratio of 99.99998%. So that kind of goes to my initial look at the significance of the oil below the oil water contact. First plunge direct physical evidence, starting out with a very low indication of any significance of oil.
So just to be clear, everything below minus 350 is included on here that's tested, correct?
Correct.
And all those tests have accumulated 55 barrels of oil, correct?
Correct.
And over 340 million barrels of water, correct?
Correct.
Okay. What's this next slide? And tell me a little bit about what it shows and explain your analysis here and how it relates to your opinion.
Okay, so one of the things on a due diligence you do is you look at any analysis that's provided and you try to do a due diligence on, hey, does it make sense with the actual physical data that you have? I'm going to focus on just the Grayberg interval, which is between -100 and -350. So that first green line. And the three petrophysical analysis here are the NewTek original, the NewTek revised, and NSAI's original oil in place. Just to start out with, I looked at from a conventional basis. So I used a 40% oil saturation cutoff for net pay. And I just took all the data that was provided and said, okay, what is the net pay? And the far column on the right is the oil net pay. So the percentage of those net feet that met that hurdle of 40%, Prosody showed that in the NewTek original, 69% of that would fit a conventional oil. So typically what you look for is a relationship between that oil net pay and the production. In NewTek's revised, they did not change their methodology for the Grayberg. The reason there's a number difference is because they had some slight changes in their tops. And then the bottom, the original NSAI model shows the same thing. So if you look at the oil net pay, I look at that 69% oil net pay, and that would suggest that if everything was equal, they should have a 69% oil cut in that area. The actual oil cut in that area is 2%. So one of the other significant things about this is most of these wells in Jim's analysis were done between 2002 and 2007. So this was probably 20 years after the water injection had occurred. So the actual state of the reservoir at that time was basically flush from a water flood with over 20 years. So it had a lot of fluid in there, a lot of oil extracted, and the current oil cut was 2%. So the petrophysical model concerned me that these net pays in a water flush zone would indicate that there's significantly high oil saturations. The revised has the same issue of very high oil net pay versus the standard conventional cutoffs. And when you look at NSAI's original thing, they also kind of overestimated the oil net pay by this kind of ratio method with it, but they had it down at 18% oil cut, and it was 2%. So in all these cases, I don't see anybody that has underestimated the oil that was in place. All basically overestimating some dramatically.
What is this analysis about the net pay in the Grayberg in the producing zone, the main pay zone of the MSU that NewTek's analyses show tell you about the reliability of their analysis in the deeper zones below -350 or below -500 feet?
Well, the concern is if it doesn't relate to the actual physical data that you have evidence for, when you're not calibrating to data, it's very difficult to believe in its accuracy. And the other thing about the original NewTek model is that if you look down on the third layer, which I've entitled a transition zone between -500 and 700, that basically has a higher oil net pay ratio than any of the zones above it. So just looking at the oil net pay in that interval, you would say that that is the best zone to be producing from an oil water contact. And all of the tests that I have below the oil water contact suggest that there's very little, if any, movable hydrocarbons in that interval.
Anything further on this slide, Mr. Knights?
I can talk for an hour on any
Yeah.
slide, so
No, let's not do that.
I'm going to
We'll
pass.
move on. Okay, so that's sort of a general overview, right? Because this was looking at all of the NewTek's analyses. And this next slide here, I think, is a specific well. Just touch on, if you would, the key takeaway, because you're looking at a specific well here, how this relates to your analysis regarding NewTek.
Yeah. Key takeaways, the producing oil water contact in 350 is on here. So they have a test above it and a test below it. The actual recoveries are on the far right. So on the above the oil water contact, it had about a 1.4% oil cut. But if you look at the green shaded, there's considerable net pay, over 40% oil saturation. Once you go below the oil water contact, you still have in the NewTek's original significant portion at well above 40% oil saturation. And even their revised version where they did change it, they still had a good portion of section above 40%. And if you look at NSAIs, again, Jim has a few points. But if you look at the actual recovery on a swab, there was 100% water cut. But I think another thing to point out is that on an ESP, which discussing residual oil is relative to the current reservoir conditions. An ESP reduces the pressure at the wellbore. So that would change the reservoir characteristics. And if there was any residual oil there, you would expect it to be mobile with an ESP, at least near wellbore. And if you look at the recoveries, it's 2 barrels of oil out of 18,000 or 0.1% oil cut, indicating there's very little conventional net pay and not a significant amount of residual oil that's close to that.
I think you said 18,000, but you meant 1,800 barrels of water.
1,800 barrels, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And you indicated here that NewTek had a San Andreas top. Explain this.
Yeah, I try to put some reference on here because almost everybody in this thing talks about San Andreas, and San Andreas is a very large unit, and they basically talk about it as one amalgamated consistent zone, and it is not. But the in this interval, the producing oil water contact at 350, you notice the San Andreas top or the aquifer as a couple feet below that. So there's a lot of discussion on where did this San Andreas water come from? Well, based on how you pick the top, it's very close to the producing oil water contact. So you wouldn't need much of anything to get some of that water in. The other thing that points here is where the saturations reach zero. So those blue highlighted lines, those would be permeability barriers in my estimation, where there's zero oil saturation and probably low porosity and low permeability. But it shows that even just below the producing oil water contact and within the Grayberg above and just below this oil water contact, there are a significant number of these permeability barriers.
Now, this next slide, explain, this is another overview. Now we're moving into, I believe, ops geologics from NewTek. Explain how this relates to your analysis or assessment, diligence assessment of ops geologics petrophysical work.
So yes, this was the third and fourth petrophysical analysis that we received. But again, comparing it to the data, comparing it to the Netherlands Soil Association analysis, I just focused on just to get it quickly over, the red in the bottom that shows significant hydrocarbon saturations in the high side, up to 70–80% oil saturation. And even in the low side, OPS model shows up to 60% oil saturation. But if you go to the core data, the direct physical evidence, there's no fluorescence, no cut, and background gas is basically background gas. That interval combined in that whole oil interval, 3,700 barrels of water and no oil, indicates that from a conventional standpoint that the both OPS's low side and high side are, I'd say, optimistic.
And what does this tell you, looking at the direct evidence, what does this tell you about the reliability of ops geologics analysis?
That is a scenario, it's very optimistic and, in my estimation, unrealistic.
Next slide here. Explain what this shows. And this, again, is looking at the EMSU, a specific well, the EMSU 679. Just hit for us the takeaway points that are important for the commission to understand here.
So due diligence, looking at the direct physical evidence, on the right-hand side, we have the EMSU core data, and it's a oil saturation and porosity. The main thing is I look at, okay, here's the actual hard physical data. What does the analysis look like? And if you go to the analysis on the left side, there's a lot of similar situations that don't exist in the core. So if you take that, just that upper left-hand box with the above the green arrow and left of the dark line, you notice in the OPS model, we have a lot of high oil saturations in these low porosity intervals. Now, if you go back to the core data on that same section, they don't exist in the core data. And that's kind of a consistent, as you go in, notice the differences in the quadrants. The other important thing here, I think, is the aquifer, which I have defined as -700 and below. Those are highlighted in the dark blue. Now, again, let's go to the core initially, and we look at the core saturations in the deeper intervals. Very low oil saturations. Now you go to the log analysis on the left side, and you notice that there's significantly higher oil saturations in the analysis that doesn't correspond or contradicts the actual core data. So again, it kind of gives you the concept that it's highly uncertain and really unreasonable that the ops geologic saturations don't match the actual physical data. So concerns in the certainty of their analysis.
Next slide here. I think this again touches on ops geologic. If you would, just a key takeaway here as the ops geologic high and low scenarios relate to your assessment of the direct evidence available in the core.
So this was the low side. On the left-hand side was the low side ops model, which was, at least from my understanding, used the core data, uncorrected core data as their base. And they say they correlated to the uncorrected and made their petrophysical analysis. But when I look at the uncorrected average core oil saturation, it's 14.86%. And if I look at their analysis, it's 30.4, almost 100% higher than the average core uncorrected. So the calibration there, from what I've read and understand, I saw a big discrepancy there. The other thing on the right-hand side is a little different display. I have both their low side and high side saturations. And this is for the 679 well that had core. And as you go down the area, the red arrows are where OPS is significantly higher than the core data. And the other thing to note on this is that as you get down below, say -5, 650 or so, there's a significant break off in the core saturations, and especially at -700, there's very, very limited oil saturation in that interval. Interestingly enough, in the Exxon sales package, they had their limiting factor at the lowest as -700 as their estimate of their bottom of the ROZ. The other thing that's curious is at the bottom of the 679 core data, you see a core analysis that has SCR. So it's solid SHR, solid hydrocarbon residue. And Trentham in his papers discusses that when you see solid hydrocarbons, that's an indication you're at the bottom of the ROZ. And there's also another core sample that's up higher that also has the SHR, solid hydrocarbon residue. And so in these things, the other thing that's interesting, if you go in the lower part, you see it in the core, a general decreasing in oil saturation as you go from, say, that 600 to 700. And that's also an indication that you're at the bottom of the ROZ or potential ROZ based on both Meltzer and Trentham's models.
Anything more on this, Mr.
I could, but I.
Okay, next one, let's move on. This next one, again, is looking at a specific well, and you've portrayed ops geologics petrophysical analysis here in a slightly different manner. Explain your key takeaway here and how it relates to your assessment of reliability and viability of ops geologic.
And this is
analysis.
just another well that shows the consistency in their petrophysical analysis, which I always enjoy. But it does show higher oil saturations in the lower porosity rock, preferably lower permeability. But the other thing it shows is that the high porosity, high quality rock with high perm, there's a significant amount of rock volume in there. And I think this relates to potential recovery, that if you were going to inject CO2, if I was a CO2 molecule, where would I go? I would go to the high perm, high porosity rock before I would migrate into the lower perm, low porosity rock. And I know typically in CO2 recoveries, you use a volume of CO2 relative to the hydrocarbon pore volume. But in these cases, with the incredible amount of pore volume in the higher porosity, higher perm, I think that may be underestimating the CO2, because you'll probably need to fill up some of that water wet hydrocarbon pore volume before you get the CO2 to focus or be forced into the lower porosity, lower perm areas.
Key takeaways from this next slide, Mr. Nice, as it relates to your discussions or the discussions up to date about porosity and cutoffs and ops geologics parameters.
Yeah, so Mr. Burkhead mentioned a number of times in his testimony that he used a 2.9 grain density for dolomite. And he basically came up with that because I'm just assuming that all of these rocks have 20% anhydrite in them. And so 2.9 is above the standard 2.87 dolomite matrix. If he used a 2.87, then all his porosities would be reduced in the dolomite sections by 1.5%. But I point you to Exhibit A5, the Exxon, and you'll notice two things in this. They used a 6% porosity cutoff, but they also used a row density of 2.84 as a basic for their matrix. That 2.84 is probably a 3.5% porosity drop. So if Mr. Burkhead would have used a 2.84, some of his porosities would be reduced by 3.5%. The table B1 and B8 are the actual core data from the 679 well. And if you look at the core pieces that were just dolomite and didn't include anything, the range was from 2.81 to 2.87. And so in some of these areas where you had a dolomite that may have been 2.82, you may have overestimated the porosity by about 5%.
And you've got an image here. What does this show?
But those are just some of the rocks. I'm a geologist. I love rocks. And so on the left-hand side, you see what a San Andres reservoir that had bugular porosity, and it was filled with anhydrite. And so a situation like that, if you use 2.9, you would create porosity in the dolomite, and you would have no porosity in the anhydrite, when in both cases it could be 0% porosity in both. But that's the way that anhydrite can, secondary anhydrite can fill pore throats and doesn't have to be at the surface. And then the middle one is a 13% 10 millidarcy San Andres rock that is fantastic. And then the other is anhydrite, which is common in these systems. But just picture the real rocks.
Next slide here. This is moving off of the petrophysical analysis, and you're getting into your barriers to water flow. Explain, if you would, Mr. Knight, starting at the top image, what this shows and where it came from, and how it relates to your analysis about water, edgewater encroachment.
Migration path.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the upper is a cross section. This is in a 1939 paper. So these were freshly drilled wells. A lot of people paying a lot of attention to it. And they broke up the reservoir into three packages. Zone A, the deepest, that probably relates to zone 5 and 6 in Lindsay's. Zone B, which is separated by a low perm interval. And then zone C, which is on the uppermost, is another flow pattern that you'd have migration up the lateral pathway for fluid migration. The other thing I've marked on here is the estimated two original oil water contacts at 325 and 350. And the thing that's important on here is noticing that zone A goes below the oil water contact interior to the field. Zone B goes to the oil water contact slightly to the edges, and zone C kind of expands past the oil water contacts, but outside of the thing. So when you're looking at a structure map of the top of the the St. Andreas or the Grayburg, that these structures change with depth.
Next, talk about how that cross-section relates to the next image below, how this relates to your analysis, and what are you showing in the next image in the same exhibit here?
So I think the simplest thing is to take the light green bounded area that says area of zone A oil. That is where the top of the zone A goes below the oil water contact. And going to the next one outside, the zone B, that's where the zone B goes below the oil water contacts. But I think the most interesting thing to me was in 1939, these hatched areas are all where they had water in the field, in the middle of the field in 1939. All these areas, if you look at this small legend, it says there was water encroachment within the field in 1934, and they migrated in 35, 36, 37, all showing that you had water movement and migration at the center of the field.
We may be having a microphone malfunction. It's been worn out. Can we take a quick break to see if it needs a new battery?
Testing, was I just not close enough?
Maybe Mr. Nice, just make sure you're close enough so that it's picking you up without interference. Or, I won't ask you to restate it, but I think just to be clear, your testimony here is that what this early paper was showing edgewater encroachment in the middle of the field. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's documented in that 1939 paper is Edgewater Drive.
In your opinion, Mr. Nice, does this Edgewater Drive that was documented back in the 1930s explain how does it relate to the arguments that Empire is making about these bubble maps showing water, unexplained water production across the field, including on the highest structure areas of the field?
Well, primarily, the preferred path of migration along bedding planes, so along the interval. So if you looked at the A, B, and C up on top, that lateral migration along the permeability bed is a preferred mechanism. Is that?
How do you feel, Mr. Hearing Officer, about the microphone?
Well, I'm thinking
Just
maybe
me?
it is a battery issue. Maybe you could just swap out with him and see if that improves it, Mr. Jorgensen.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
That's better.
Right.
So good.
I'll try to be a little more direct too.
So I think, Mr. Nice, you were explaining that, in your opinion, that with the perm barriers would create preferential lateral pathways for edgewater encroachment up onto the structure. Is that right?
Yes, correct. And even those vertical perm barriers, as John Macbeth was asking, that in the 211 you have over 30 or 40 feet, you have permeability barriers that cause pressure separation from the reservoirs, indicating that these horizontal bedding planes, even though thin, could be very valid permeability barriers. So another thing that comes up when you start talking about the migration paths along the bedding planes, if you go to the 1998 Love paper, he talks about conformance issues. That conformance diagram that he used are basically in the area on the crest of the structure. And they denoted that there were high perm streaks in that interval along horizontal beds where water cycled through the water flood, and that they could cut those off by putting cement and causing those high perm streaks that were horizontal to be blocked off. And that seems like a very simple pathway to get water from the edgewater, either down dip or near these water contacts, to any place in the actual field.
How does this analysis relate, Mr. Nice, to Dr. Buckwalter's model and analysis where he could only find his only explanation for this water was from the San Andreas. How does this explain what could have been done differently in his model that could using very structure to answer his problem or address his dilemma?
Well, very simply, Buckwalter decided, how do I get water to this well? Well, he put a vertical fracture like this through, the 82 horizontal barriers to get the water there. If you look at that 1998 pair, a very simple explanation would be a small high perm streak along a bedding plane that would bring Edgewater Drive to anywhere in the field.
But he didn't do that in his model, did he?
No, and he also didn't incorporate any geology, which I thought was, since they had 4 petrophysical analysis, none of the porosity perms or oil in place were used in his model either.
One other item here. Well, let me ask this question. Based on your analysis of this Edgewater Drive and the structure and preferential pathways for flow, is this sufficient to explain, in your opinion, the water bubble maps from Mr. West's testimony showing, to his testimony, unexplained water production around the EMSU?
I would say it's the more reasonable assumption that's how this water got into the area.
In fact, that was the determination back in the 30s. Is that right?
Correct.
The one other item here that you didn't address that I'd like you just to touch on, you've called out specifically the EMSU 239. Explain why you have that called out here and how it relates to this overall analysis.
Well, again, like any due diligence, what you look for is anomalies in the data and you investigate those. So that really high water contact bubble was basically at the 239 well. And so I looked at that well, and it was initially completed in the Queen as a gas well and in the upper San Andreas as an oil well. And it was completed in 1936 and made about 104 barrels a day. And then by 1959, it was down at about 20 barrels a day. And then, so that indicated that reservoir was actually depleting. So it was isolated from anything below it. In 1973, they drilled that well down below the oil water contact. They did not have a test, but that was 1973, and they perfed that interval. Then in 1981 is the next really data point I have, is that map that shows that well had high water. And so it just seems, besides my original geology of, I think the water came from Edgewater through high perm streaks along bedding plains, that even the wells that have high water could be explained easily by drilling below the oil water contact. The other thing about that oil water contact is that's the original oil water contact at 350, but in 1973, there had been a significant amount of oil produced in all these zones. So that also could impact the Edgewater Drive coming in up above the structure in the lower zones. And Love in the 1998 paper also mentions Edgewater Drive. And so I think the explanations for the higher water contact are using the simplest explanation is the bedding plane geology Edgewater Drive.
In your investigations, did you identify any literature that identified that the explanation for the water production in the EMSU was from San Andreas fractures coming up?
No, I saw no evidence of any fracture communication.
I think when you were talking about the 239, I think you may have said that it was completed in the upper San Andreas, but it was a Grayberg well.
I mean,
right?
Grayberg.
Okay.
I apologize.
Yes, Grayberg well.
Thank you for correcting that.
Anything further on this slide, Mr. Knights?
No.
Okay. Next slide here, if you would just touch on the high points, the key takeaways here and how it relates to your assessment of Ops Geologics parameters in their analysis.
Well, Ops Geologic used the only thing they varied was a sensitivity on oil saturation. Typically in the oil industry, use permeability cutoffs to do a net pay sensitivity. And so I just wanted to show on this thing, if they had used a porosity or a permeability to look at the sensitivity to their oil in place, that would have been probably a more valid. The things I put on here are what they used as a baffle cutoff of 1.5% porosity. And then I also put on here their permeability models that show it relates to an incredibly low permeability. So the threshold for their perm barriers is unreasonable to me. They used a 4% fee effective for their actual cutoffs. And if you look at their perm bears, that relates to a 0.005 and a 0.01 millidarcy, which is relatively aggressive since the typical oil industry standard is for a gas reservoir 0.1 millidarcy and for an oil reservoir 1 millidarcy. I also put on here Jim Davidson's 7% fee effective. Using this model, that would at least have some intervals from a conventional basis above 1 millidarcy, probably a 50-50 cutoff, which is a standard way of using a cutoff. And then one thing I always like to look at is a high end. What does the high quality reservoir look like? How much of this reservoir is high quality? And at 10%, that would mean most of the rock above 10% has a greater than 1 millidarcy permeability.
Using that assessment, Mr. Knights, what does this tell you about ops geologics?
So just, again, describing the reservoir is a critical component, especially in a tertiary recovery. So if you go from right to left, the 31% of this rock using a 10% porosity cutoff is really high quality. So you have a third of the rock is really high quality, high porosity, good perm. And so that's going to where most of your recovery factor is going to come from. If you go down to the 7%, Jims, you basically have another third of the reservoir that's reasonably good reservoir, probably 50-60% of it's going to be higher than 1 millidarcy, 56% going to be lower. But that portion of your oil in place will have a lower recovery factor. Now you go to ops geologic and you say, okay, 4% porosity, what do we get? Well, we get another third of the reservoir. So a third of their reservoir is what I would consider poor quality, low permeability. But in the ops model, as we saw previously, that's where most of their oil is in place.
Just to be clear, the color coding here relates to your tiering across the MSU, correct?
Yes, and basically the ratios are basically the same for each one of those areas, but the green would be the producing Grayberg, the potential ROZ would be from -350, the producing oil water contact, down to 500, -500, the transition zone between 500 and 700, and the aquifer is from -700 and below.
And Goodnight's disposal operations are in what you've identified as the aquifer, right? Below -700.
Correct. Okay. All their injection is below in the aquifer.
Just real quick, the key takeaways here, discussing ops geologics analysis and their unreasonable, in your opinion, unreasonable parameters. How does this relate to your determination about barriers across the zone?
Yeah, the little green bars on the left-hand side, and you almost can't see them on the right-hand well, but there are, I think, 2 little baffles that are identified using that 1.5%. But if you just go to the 7%, or even simpler is if you look at OPS's permeability model on the right-hand columns, those areas that do not have any wiggles, that is below 0.2 millidarcies. And if you use that 0.2 millidarcies, you'd have significant perm barriers. The black lines I estimated at about 7% porosity cutoff. And if you look at those in the well to the right, you have probably a 50-foot zone that's continuous low perm. And if you just correlate that over to the well on the left, that comes out to, I don't know, probably 100 feet of continuous vertical low perm that would be a significant perm barrier by any estimation. And if you go up and down the well, you have a significant number of these small perm barriers. But again, looking at the 211 well, you only need a few feet of perm barrier to create pressure isolation. But all of these intervals were going to be tremendously impeding any potential vertical flow through the intervals.
And again, you've got your tiering based on mean sea level on the right-hand side, right?
Correct. That's an unambiguous depth rather than an ambiguous nomenclature name.
Okay. Next slide here. Again, talking about perm barriers and potential fracture pathways. What does this tell you? What does this next exhibit show and a slide show on?
So this is the R.R. Bell San Andreas core, and basically you can read through, but there's a number of those zones that are horizontal thin beds that are very low permeability. I think there's one that's 0.3 millidarcy, 0.3, 0.1 millidarcy. All those would be significant barriers to vertical flow, and they are along bedding planes. And you can see the different colors of the rocks as you go up and down. Each one of those is a separate depositional environment that's a bedding plane that goes across the EMSU. So basically, horizontal layers that are sufficiently low to be permeability barriers to vertical flow.
Are you seeing any vertical fractures indicated at this?
And I see no vertical fractures in this section of this rock, which in part is, as far as I can tell, the only evidence indicating fractures, but I don't see any in this well. And then the extension of those fractures through the Grayberg and through the permeability zone around Jim's high gamma ray spike and his anhydrites, and then getting those down to there. I don't see any evidence in this photo that there's an extensive vertical fracture network.
Continuing on your discussion and analysis about vertical fractures here, this is from the core of the EMSU 679. I think this is from Empire's exhibit, but you made some modifications to it. Explain to the commission what you did here and what how this relates to your analysis about potential fracturing and communication between the zones.
So the implication that fractures are going to extend 300 to 400 feet down into the San Andreas using the 679 data. If you look at this one 8-foot section of core, what you can see is that there are fractures, but they're isolated to individual layers. So you have a fractured interval, and then you go above, and then you see a non-stained, non-fractured interval. Then you see a stained interval, and then a non-fractured stained interval. So none of these fractures extend over a large vertical section. The other thing that in Lindsay's paper, if you read it, it basically says that most of, or predominantly, these fractures occur in karsted areas, and these karsts are layers. So it's not a large karst like Carlsbad Cavern. These are layers that are bedded, and if those are fractured, that would also indicate that you can have significant perm along a karst, but it's going to be along a bedding plane that would allow fluid to migrate along the bedding planes up from the edgewater drive or any other mechanism. But the primary fluid migration pattern is going to be along bedding planes, and that's just standard geology.
Moving on to oil, I think this is getting into the oil in place analysis or some more discussion about ops geologics assessment about the potential for production here. What does this show, and explain how it relates to your analysis?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about San Andreas water. So I just took the OPS's San Andreas structure map, and on the right-hand side, labeled all the wells that have drilled below the producing oil water contact and into the San Andreas. And so I think there's 9 wells that are penetrated below the producing oil water contact and in the San Andreas by their definitions. There are also a number of wells that are very close to the producing oil water contact. And again, this producing oil water contact was designated in 1939 or so. And so post that drilling, there's been a significant amount of extraction of oil, which would have helped that edgewater migrate up along bedding planes into the center of the thing. The other thing this indicates is it goes later on, but that we already have wells penetrating into the San Andres, and if there was any oil there, it would probably be already depleted.
And again, that's the San Andres as defined by Ops Geologic, right?
Yes,
And that's above what Empire has identified as its perm barrier, correct?
correct.
Okay. Next slide here, just at a high level, what does this show and how does it relate to your analysis?
Well, another thing that was brought up in this thing was a recovery factor. And so tall cotton is the only isolated CO2 recovery in an ROZ zone. So I basically had to look at it. And basically my analysis using just a standard rate cum plot showed that there was 8 million barrels of oil as my estimate of ultimate recovery. The current recovery now is about 5 million barrels.
Okay, and that's the basic gist of this one, the key takeaway.
Key takeaway, I've got my estimate of 8 million barrels is the recovery of the tall cotton complete at 10-acre spacing.
Okay. Next slide here, and how does that relate to this analysis of the tall cotton field?
Well, the way to get to a recovery factor is you have to have an oil in place and a recovery. So I've got a recovery at 8 million barrels. Now I need to figure out what oil in place I'm going to use. Basically, I came up with 126 million barrels per section, and that EUR at 10-acre spacing was 8 million, and you come up with a recovery factor of 6%. The other, I'm sure people will ask me questions about this.
Well, there's something you feel is important to say, but
Well, it's just that the tall cotton, even though it's a lesser quality rock than most of the other CO2 floods that I've reviewed, the EMSU is significantly less quality rock with respect to porosity, oil saturation in the cores, and net to gross than the tall cotton. So my estimate is that a range of between 1 and 6% recovery factor would be reasonable, using the tall cotton as an analogy and using OPS's net pay cutoffs as a standard.
next slide here, explain how this relates to your analysis or economic analysis of potential recovery in the EMSU based on Ops Geologic's petrophysics.
Yeah, so this is Ops Geologic low side cases. I used their low side case because I thought the high side case was unreasonable and out of expectations. But what it does show is that there's a concentration of oil in place, basically just in the crest. So identified by about 3 or 4 wells. The upper San Andres, which has already been penetrated and produced, it has a bit in that core area of about 4 sections. They have about 10 million barrels of oil per section. And 10 million barrels at 10 acres comes out to about 156,000 barrels. And I just did, okay, on a per well basis, 1 to 6% recovery would be 1,500 barrels or 9,300 barrels, which are incredibly low. And then I went to the lower San Andres, which is a much thicker reservoir. If you look at the thickness, it's between 900 and 1,000 feet thick. Other interesting thing here is that the RR Bell, which is an older well, is kind of a unique oil in place calculation. If you look at that, it's 40 million barrels per section, but all the other wells around it are, in the 20 million barrels. And anytime you see an anomaly like that, again, you'd like to investigate it and say, is there a normalization process with the petrophysics, or is there something that unusual, or is that just a single 40-acre amount of oil in place? The other thing you can notice on these maps is you extrapolate outside of this area, the oil in place significantly reduces. And if you look at some of the estimates from Empire, they've used a constant oil in place across the entire unit. But if I was going to do a pilot, I would, if you believe these maps, I would use these areas as my pilot project. But based on my recovery factors from the tall cotton, I see very little evidence of economic potential recovery.
Now, you mentioned Empire using a constant saturation across an area. Are you talking about their economic analysis that Mr. West presented?
Yes, and John Macbeth's analysis as well.
Okay. And you reviewed Empire's economic analysis?
Briefly, yes.
Okay. And did you identify that they were using any of the data provided by any of their experts, the petrophysics geologists, in their economic analysis?
No, they did not.
Okay. Next slide here. This is, I think, your last slide. Explain what this means and how it relates, again, to your analysis about whether or not there's potentially economic recoverable hydrocarbons.
Yeah, I mean,
MSU.
most of my analysis on this was rebutting some other analysis, but in my opinion, Jim Davidson's analysis seemed to fit the data better than anybody else's. So using his analysis, and especially since Jim created his model, but then he applied it to 5 other blind tests outside of the EMSU, and they all corroborated the actual data. So I felt very comfortable that his model was at least a reasonable representation of the oil in place in the EMSU. If you look down at the table in the bottom, if you notice the other tables were 10 million barrels per section and 20 million barrels per section. Now in the producing zone, the actual Grayberg, I have about 21 million barrels in the Grayberg on a per section basis. But as you go below that, the potential residual oil zone, which is the 150 feet below the producing oil water contact, I have about 9 million barrels in per section. Now, if you get down to the transition zone between 500 and 700, I've got about 5-6 million barrels in place. And even if you use the most exaggerated recovery factors, that becomes insignificant relative to economics. And anything below negative 700, where the Goodnight is injecting, it's just minuscule, significantly insignificant to any concept of economic recovery.
Mr. Knights, you testified at the beginning that you had experience conducting evaluations assessments for more than 24 CO2 fields across the Central Basin Platform, right?
Correct.
How does this proposed project here in the MSU relate to what you've seen and you've assessed in terms of CO2 recovery or potential for an actual project relative to your experience across the Central Basin Platform?
It would be significantly below the quality of reservoirs that I've evaluated previously.
In fact, have you seen anything in your analysis that would, does this compare in any way to anything you've seen in your analyses of CO2 recovery projects?
No, this is a unique animal. Like I mentioned before, all these things are unique animals, and you have to take it from the data that you have and evaluate it. But I think from the, in my opinion, there's a significant physical data to suggest that Jim's petrophysical analysis is probably the most accurate of all. And the other thing I can say is that I don't think anybody has underestimated the oil in place. So I think there's another case that could be lower than Jim's.
What is your opinion? When you refer to Jim, you're referring to Dr. Davidson, correct?
Yes, I apologize. Dr. Davidson and I work in the same office, so I'm very familiar with him.
Okay. What's your opinion about whether Empire's producing zone and Goodnight Midstream's disposal zone are in communication?
There's absolutely no evidence that there's any communication, and there's significant evidence that says there's significant number of permeability barriers between the Goodnight injection zone and all of the shallow producing zones and the potential ROZ zones that are above, say, Jim's gamma ray spike at about -500. So my overall concept is between -500 and up is unique, separate. There's some oil saturation up there that somebody might be able to go after. And then from 700 down, it is a complete separate isolated reservoir that has unique characteristics. And those two won't interfere with each other at all.
What's your opinion about whether Goodnight's injection is impairing Empire's ability to develop recoverable hydrocarbons? And
Object. Object. This is outside the scope of any of his filed testimony.
Mr. Rankin?
Mr. Hearing Officer, Mr. Knights has testified that the scope of his testimony is to evaluate the geology, whether there's any recoverable hydrocarbons and whether there's any communication between those zones that would affect recovery. That is exactly what his scope of testimony is.
I'll allow it overruled.
Mr. Knights, what's your opinion about whether Goodnight's injection is impairing Empire's ability to develop recoverable hydrocarbons and Goodnight's disposal interval in the EMSU?
It would have no impact, in my opinion.
What's your opinion about whether Empire can develop a potential ROZ in the shallower EMSU intervals while Goodnight continues to dispose of produced water into its disposal zone?
I think that's very correct. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah,
So I
sure.
answered that a little more concisely.
What's your opinion about whether Empire can potentially develop an ROZ in the shallower EMSU intervals while Goodnight continues to dispose of produced water into its disposal zone?
Yes, I think, is that the shortest answer?
Yeah, I mean, in other words, is your opinion
Yes,
that
they're completely isolated and separated, and any activity above negative 500 or above negative 700 and below 700, they're going to be completely isolated.
based on everything you reviewed and everything you've heard, do you believe there's any basis to suspend Goodnight's injection operations?
No, I do not.
Objection. This is absolutely outside of anything the witness would have personal knowledge on, and it's speculation in terms of what the commission should do.
Okay.
Sorry, that, I didn't have that, my mic on. That'll be for the commission to decide. Sustained.
Very well. Mr. Knights, you've heard some discussion during Empire's testimony from their witnesses that more data is required in order to make a determination on the potential for RZ development in the MSU. What's your opinion about whether or not more data is required to make that determination?
I believe there's plenty of data here to make a decision. I think well, somebody will ask me. I'll go.
So your bottom line takeaway is that there's plenty of data to make a decision about whether there's a potential RZ or whether there's injection impacting the recoverable, any potential recoverable hydrocarbons, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Hearing Officer, at this time I have, well, let me ask you this, Mr. Knights. What's your bottom line takeaway opinion about what the Empire's proposing to do here and what Goodnight has been doing, and what's your bottom line analysis about those two things?
Well, I think there's two different separate isolated reservoir potential, and one is an aquifer that is incredibly large and unusual, and one is shallow and isolated and has, in my opinion, maybe a marginal amount of oil in place to be attacked from an economic standpoint.
You said that the St. Andrews is very large, correct?
Yes, I think one of the most interesting things that have come up is that it is actually under pressure, so 0.38 psi per foot, and the amount of withdrawal of fluid and the amount of injected fluid with seemingly no indication of pressure buildups indicates that it's just a tremendously large reservoir. And it goes back to Meltzer and Trensom's theories about how this water was placed and how the migration paths happened and where they did. And it matches with the larger scope things that we see in the Central Basin Platform on where the oil is.
Okay. And that just explain, if you would, how that relates to your bottom line opinion. I mean, the size of the reservoir and the pressures, how does that relate to your ultimate conclusions here?
Well, the concept of fluid migration, especially vertically, would need a pressure differential and a reason to go up. And when you have a significantly large reservoir that's under pressured and with the withdrawal rates and injection rates showing that has incredibly high permeability, there is no reason for the water to go up at all.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Knights. Mr. Hearing Officer, I have no further questions of Mr. Knights and make him available for cross-examination.
All right, it's 10:24. Why don't we take, we'll call it 10:25 to make the math easier. Let's come back at 10:40. We'll take our mid-morning break. ready in the back there, Sheila?
Yes, we're ready.
And Madam Court Reporter?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right, let's go back on the record and Mr. Waymeyer, cross-examination.
Thank you. We've never met before and didn't get a chance to visit the deposition. That was somebody else. Yeah.
Correct.
Very good. I want to, similar to my visit with Dr. Davidson, what I want to kind of talk a little bit about is some of the data relied on, some of your methods and ultimate conclusions. And before getting into that, I wanted to talk about some of the process that brought you here. I'm going to try to share my screen. And in terms of your original report, do you remember authoring a report on or about August 26, 2024?
Yes.
Okay. And if we get down to your signature page, you signed that report?
Correct.
That was under penalty of perjury?
I would assume so.
And in fact, you also stamped numerous of your reports with your geology seal?
Correct.
When you put the stamp on the report, do you remember, did you stamp this one?
I don't know. Is it on there?
I don't know if I lost it on the watermark with the copy job. I've seen it on others. I just don't know if I lost it in
I
the watermark.
do not know.
Okay, what's the significance when you stamp those reports?
It's just a professional geologic stamp license. I'm a licensed petroleum geologist.
Basically, that the work conforms with the standards associated with your license.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Rankin covered at the start of your testimony some of these changes you made, and I just want to make sure the commissioners have a handle on how drastic these changes were that you made. The first change, you said you were working in the wrong foot increments in interpreting Dr. Davidson's work. Is that right?
Correct.
And so will you explain to the commissioners what your error was when you signed your first report under penalty of perjury with respect to that half-foot increment?
You sum the hydrocarbon pore volumes, and I assumed that it was
Looks like you're
1
coming out
foot,
about
but it was
25 keystrokes per hour.
Okay.
And the accuracy wasn't too far off either. It was at 88%.
that wasn't me, was it?
No, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila, for cutting that person off.
Okay, could you rephrase the question?
Yes, sir. With respect to the half-foot increment that you erred on in the first place, will you tell the commission how you made that error?
It was a list of hydrocarbon pore volumes, and I summed them up, but it was for half foot, so I need to multiply it by 0.5. And it was, the file was labeled that confused me.
So with respect to your opening testimony, you rendered opinions as a geologist about hydrocarbons in place here. Yes.
Correct.
Tell the commissioners by way of order of magnitude how this changed those oil in place estimates.
100%.
So you swore under penalty of perjury. You think you actually stamped this thing with your geology seal with Netherlands Sewell letterhead, and you can tell the commission Netherlands Sewell letterhead's on here. Yeah.
Correct.
And you said these are my opinions. These are the reasonable opinions based on my work. And you were literally off in terms of the hydrocarbons before this commission by a factor of 100%.
Correct.
Okay. How did the error come to your attention?
I'm not really sure.
Now, there were, and that wasn't the only change. After Mr. Padilla took your deposition, and Mr. Padilla, he's not a geologist, is he?
I don't know.
Okay. Mr. Padilla takes your deposition and you make another big change to your opinions, don't you?
Relative big. I changed from 30% cutoff to 20% saturation cutoff.
Okay. Tell the commissioners in terms of order of magnitude on the saturation cutoffs, how does that affect the volumes of hydrocarbon here, oil in place?
I don't know, but it added oil in place.
A significant amount, doesn't it?
I don't really remember. Maybe 25%.
Okay, so you're off by a multiple of 100% because you didn't know the correct foot increments. And then you're off by another 20 to 30% because of the cutoff percentage.
Yes.
How did that error come to your attention?
That wasn't an error. That was a interpretation. I used 30% in my original, more of a what I expect the oil in place to be. But then I realized that everybody else was using 20. And so I thought, well, just for relative purposes, I should join the bandwagon and use 20% water saturation cutoff.
Okay, but water saturation cut, I mean, that's a big variable and input into all of these formulae that arrive in oil in place.
Yeah, it's one of the primary cutoffs.
And the scientific method you used for making a deviation from what you swore to in the first place to what you swore to and sealed in the second place was you quote unquote wanted to join the crowd?
Yes, to make it easily for comparable reasons.
Okay. One of the slides that Mr. Rankin visited with you on, first, with respect to the core and 679, did you ever physically look at that core?
No, I had pictures.
Well, I guess if you didn't physically look at the core, you also never went in and described the core. Do I have that right?
Correct.
Thought I had Mr. Rankin's presentation already pulled up to avoid wasting your time. I didn't, but let me get to it. Do you have those handy? His slide deck? That would be a help, probably. Actually, it threw me off. It was titled trial exhibits. I did have it. I was thinking this is not trial exhibits. It's the presentation, but I've got it. All right.
Everybody makes a mistake.
We're in the presentation that you just went through. And I want to focus on this core. So we know you didn't look at the core. We know you didn't describe the 679 core. In building a facies model, which is what Dr. Davidson used, yes?
I believe he did.
Wouldn't it be really important to actually look at the core and study the core and describe the core as part of building that facies model?
Not necessarily.
You also didn't use the R Bell core at all as part of the analysis, did you?
In my analysis?
In Dr. Davidson's analysis, which again, you rely on his analysis in terms of building oil in place numbers, right?
Yes, it's petrophysical analysis.
Yeah, wouldn't using the R Bell core have been important to that if you're going to rely on a facies model?
I really don't know.
With respect to the facies model, in terms of rock facies, that would be a geologist that would assist with identifying and selecting rock facies. Yes?
It would be helpful to be a geologist.
Did you assist Dr. Davidson in his rock facies selection?
No.
Hey, Dr. Davidson, is he a geologist?
Not by degree, no.
Why didn't you help Dr. Davidson with the rock facies selection if you're a geologist or actually a geologist that's been designated as an expert in this case?
Because Jim is an expert petrophysicist, and one of his main jobs is describing rocks from their petrophysical characteristics, which are not always visual, but actually quantitative.
As we talk about reliability of testimony, I want to focus in on this EMSU 679 court. Did you add the purple arrows that go up and down?
The blue and green arrows I added, and the depths at the bottom I added.
So the 4230, 4232?
Yes.
And the descriptions there to the side of the blue arrows, when it says non-fractured, non-oil stained, did you add that?
Yes.
And so what you were, in your testimony with Mr. Rankin, what you were explaining is that you have oil stained intervals that you can see the staining, and then you can have an interval next to it that's non-oil stained.
Correct.
Will you help me, and just so that the commissioners, as we assess qualifications and reliability of testimony, how are these cores prepared?
I would assume standard procedures.
Can you describe those standard procedures?
Not specifically.
Now, if we just let's take this one as an example. Can you see my cursor? I'm at 4236. Do you see the blue arrow?
Yes.
And then there's a green arrow immediately below it. You added both of those.
Correct.
And you saw fit to add the verbiage non-fractured, non-oil stained to the one below it.
Correct.
Explain to the commissioners what's important about that distinction between the stained above and the non-oil stained below, according to you.
It shows stratigraphic variation over limited intervals of about a foot to half a foot, that you can have stratigraphic variations in a horizontal sense.
Can you explain, as a matter of geology, how on earth it could be that you could have this you would agree this is very highly oil stained right here where I'm indicating at the bottom of the green arrow?
Correct.
And then just immediately touching it, there would be no oil staining whatsoever?
Correct.
Just explain, as a geologist, how that happens so that the commissioners understand.
Well, there's probably a permeability separation, a depositional separation. It could be an unconformity, that the fluid properties migrating through one does not migrate through the other. And it also indicates that there's lateral migration and not vertical migration.
And yesterday, as a scientist, are you familiar with the term that Dr. Davidson used after coming back from the break and visiting with counsel, called a preponderance of the evidence?
Objection.
Preponderance of the evidence.
Characterization, objection.
Rephrase, leave out the after visiting with counsel.
Have you ever heard of, so you were in here when we visited with Dr. Dave, when we were on this issue of barriers. And I said, are you going to sit here for Netherland Sewell and tell these commissioners that there's a barrier? And he said, no. You remember that?
I remember that diatribe. I'm not really sure I understand what the conclusions were.
And then we came back from lunch and he started speaking of a preponderance standard. Do you remember that?
I don't remember those exact words, but.
Does preponderance have any scientific meaning? Is preponderance, sounds kind of like a legal thing. Does preponderance have any meaning in your science world?
I mean, to me, it means a lot.
Okay.
I have more than just a piece of data.
And we may have just missed, is that a scientific term that you're aware of before?
Scientific, I don't know if I have a scientific dictionary, but not a defined scientific term.
As you worked with Dr. Davidson over the last 15, 20 years, have you ever heard him use the phrase or term preponderance?
I don't know.
Well, let's speak here. I asked why, as we look at this 4236, and again, this would, there were, after all the work and the many written statements in the case that you've signed, There's been at least 5 different signed statements by you, right?
I think, yeah, one revised, and a sir, 5.
Yep. Plus a sworn deposition.
So is that 6?
Yeah, well, and I wasn't counting the deposition, but I mean,
Okay.
you did that too. So after all of those, Mr. Rankin and you selected 24 slides here, give or take. I may be off of one to come and tell the story. And this was one of them, right?
Yes.
As a matter, and I asked, how on earth do you explain that? And you said, you gave the commissioners how you would explain the difference between how you can have oil staining immediately above and non-oil stain immediately below, right?
Yes, I'm
And is that?
not sure I understand that question.
Yeah, I asked, how as a matter of science do you explain this highly oil stained core and then immediately below it, there's no staining at all? And you gave the commissioners under oath here an explanation, according to you as a geologist, how that happens.
Now it could happen, yes.
And is that to the standard of whatever certainty you would hold yourself to and Netherland Sewell to as part of your work in this case?
I believe that's a good explanation of how that could occur.
Yeah, it's not just a wild guess. I mean, this is a slide. You chose 24 slides. This was one you thought was most important. I asked, how on earth does this happen from what you decided was an important slide? You gave the commissioners your answer, and you're standing by that, and that's the degree of rigor that you as an expert bring to it. Yes?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Is this a part of a full diameter core analysis?
This is probably a half slab core.
And so with respect to core analysis, with respect to each foot, are they going to actually pull that core out and clean it before measuring porosity and permeability?
I would probably say in some cases they do, in some cases they don't.
And then there's going to be a smaller piece from the thick side of the slab core that's crushed to acquire oil and water saturation.
Correct.
And the cleaning of the core, that's going to be done before the core is slabbed, correct?
Before the core is slabbed.
Yes. The cleaning of the core to measure porosity and permeability is going to happen before the core is slabbed. Do you understand that that is part of the core lab process on full diameter core analysis?
Partly, I would defer to my petrophysical expert on that. He understands.
And then the slab and then only after all of that is the slab going to be photographed and described, or you don't know?
That could be a procedure.
So
Seems reasonable.
So following full diameter core analysis, the core will have been stripped of all appearance of non-oil stained core in each foot and a piece of core that is oil stained. And then you get the photographs. In terms of the procedure that came for these photographs to be, you have no idea, do you?
Typically, they're not cleaned before they do the core analysis.
Dr. Lindsay shot through the roof when he saw this slide from you. Do you understand that the explanation for how 2 pieces of core that are touching each other and one is heavily oil stained and the other one is not, is that it has literally been cleaned out as part of this procedure? That literally all of the oil that was in that slab that looked just like the one above it.
Objection,
It's
Mr.
been
Weimar is
washed out.
testifying.
Overruled.
So yes, that could be an explanation for that as well.
Wouldn't that be a more likely, I'm not a geologist, but wouldn't that be, just looking at this thing, wouldn't that seem to make more sense as a matter of science when you see something that heavily oil stained immediately above the one that's not?
Yes, I think that would be reasonable.
Why before coming in here and giving the commission these opinions, did you not do the work to be able to speak authoritatively and clearly on important issues like this?
I guess I could have done more rigorous detail, but the specifics I was trying to get to here was that the fractures do not extend across vertical.
Well, as we talk about fractures, again, so to help orient the commissioners, that this core is about 3 inches in diameter, give or take, 3.5 inches.
Okay.
And so as we get this core, even if it went all the way down to the Grayberg, you're only getting to look at 3 inches. And so if a fracture is apparent here and doesn't work perfectly vertically straight through the entire core, it's going to meander outside of the 3 inches and you're not going to see the continuous nature. Isn't that right?
Correct.
And so as you talk about non-continuous fractures that they're observed in shorter intervals, there's no way to view one fracture that's going to go perfectly straight up in the core, is there?
Correct.
Now, just while we're on the slide, and I'm jumping around a bit, but fracture studies, did you perform any fracture studies here?
No.
Did you perform any frac gradient studies?
No.
And so if the commissioners wanted to know with respect to these fractures, and we can agree that there's fractures in this core, right?
Correct.
And because you showed a different slide, I'm now working off of your slide 18 that doesn't show a lot of fractures. That was one of the reasons you chose this one?
No, I chose this one because it had some stratigraphic variability and permeability variability.
Okay. Obviously, whether we're talking R Bell or the 679, we can certainly find plenty of sections in that core that has extensive fractures in it, can't we?
I do not know. I didn't look at all the core.
Okay. With respect to and I guess the discussion about fractures, was that really to the ends of Mr. Rankin's questions over this idea of impermeable barriers or baffles or barriers to flow?
Could you restate that question?
Yeah, just why we're talking about fractures.
Why we're talking about, is that a question or?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah, and I appreciate you asking me to rephrase. The reason that we're talking about fractures in core is because this is part of your story on the testimony that pertains to communication between the Grayberg and the San Andreas.
Correct.
And so, did you review Bob Lindsay's fracture study that he prepared?
Yes.
And he's also now prepared one for the R Bell core. Would you like to see that one?
Not really.
Okay. But I'm trying to understand in terms of the baffles, what were your parameters for setting a baffle flag? Or did you set the baffle flag, or are those Dr. Davidson's over on the?
Those are Dr. Davidson's.
Did you come up with any baffle flags?
The only baffle flags are on one of my other slides here where I represented 2 wells using a sensitivity of where I would create some baffles in those 2 logs.
And what were your standards for those baffles?
Well, there are 2 visual things. One using Dr. Burhead's permeability estimate of less than 0.2 millidarcies. And then I also used a 7% porosity as an analogy for things that are less than 1 millidarcy per.
You've seen Mr. Burkhead's slides. There are certainly places in the core that have very low porosity, but very high permeability.
Low porosity and high permeability.
Yes.
Yes.
That is a characteristic of the rock in this area. You will find places that have low porosity, high permeability.
Yes, the lower the porosity, the least likely it is to have high perm.
However, as it comes to bear here on what was actually observed and measured in the core, that is not the case in a great many places. There are plenty of places with low porosity that have very high permeability.
Plenty of, I didn't do a statistical analysis on that.
So in terms of talking about barriers to flow or baffles to flow, you have not done a study looking at, in instances of low porosity, what the permeability looks like. Is that true?
No, I've looked at all the porosity perm plots. So I've looked at all that data.
And so now I'm just going to illustrate. Can you see this is a slide. I think you either showed the exact slide or some variation of it, right?
Yeah, I understand it though.
And to orient the commissioners, the purple dots are core measurements out of the 679. Lighter green is North Monument, blue is the 458, and the other shade of green is the Bell, correct?
Or is that for me correct?
Yes.
Yes.
And so with respect to your baffle cutoff, you said you were looking at 7% porosity.
That was one of my estimates, and the other was 0.02 millidarcy from Dr. Burkett's work.
0.02 or 0.2?
0.02.
0.02. And so if it was less than 7% porosity, did you give consideration to permeability or did you call that a baffle?
No, I just said that was a perm barrier, potential perm barrier.
Something with less than 7% porosity, you called a potential perm barrier.
Correct.
That was the only standard.
No, also the 0.02 millidarcy from Dr. Burkett's work.
So would it have to be less than 0.07? I'm sorry, would it have to be less than 7% porosity and also less than 0.2 millidarcy in permeability?
No.
So if it was merely under 7% porosity, that was enough. It tripped a flag for you to call a perm barrier.
Yeah, potential perm barrier.
Irrespective of what the permeability would be below that 7%.
Correct.
Where in science would you find that 7% porosity would be a perm barrier? Where can I read that as a matter of industry standard or acceptance?
Now that is literature, I'm not sure, but 7% is basically that 50-50. Half of those are above 1 millidarcy and half of them are below 1 millidarcy. So it gets you a likelihood that is maybe not more than likely, but a reasonable vertical perm barrier.
Okay. And so if and I'm not being a smart aleck with this, but other than taking your say so, if the commissioners wanted to know where does this standard of less than 7% porosity somehow become a perm barrier, what is that?
It would go back to the porosity perm plot, and you look at the plot and you look at 7% porosity and you look at the distribution of permeabilities within there. You do have a few points that are very, very high permeability, but you have a significant portion of those that are lower permeability. And so when you put those barriers up, if you have a significant number of, there's a 50-50 chance that that's a perm barrier, and you have enough of those, it becomes a preponderance of evidence.
So, and I'm just trying to understand this because you didn't give consideration to permeability on your 7% porosity cutoff for making a barrier. And I hear you're cutting it two ways. You would cut it at Mr. Burkhead's 0.2 millidarcy on perm.
0.02.
Or 0.02, or you would cut it at anything under 7% porosity, right?
Yes, those are two reasonable definitions of permeability. The 0.02 is probably highly likely. The 7% is probably reasonably likely.
But wouldn't you want to know what the if you're cutting this off at 7% porosity, wouldn't you want to know based on these particular rock properties, what permeability looks like in that rock?
Well, the problem with using actual permeability is you need a core data. And for 99.9% of the rock, when you're making these analysis, you're not going to have core data. So you're going to have to use some statistical analysis to determine more than likely or less than likely what the perm of that rock would be if you did not have core data. And if you look at this graph, you can see that very few points at 7% porosity are in the high permeability. So it's very unlikely that you'll have a 7% or lower porosity that has a high permeability, but you will have some.
Well, help me in this is me being a lawyer and not an engineer or a scientist. I'm seeing the 7% your cutoff. Am I indicating correctly on this x-axis with the cursor where your cutoff would be?
Yes.
If we move over to, am I at the right increment over here at the far left, this 0.02
Yes.
millidarcy? And so as you talk about core, aren't all of the data plots that I'm circling here instances that would be over 0.02 millidarcy of permeability, but less than 7% porosity that were actually measured in these 4 different cores?
Correct.
And obviously, if you have those types of millidarcy of permeability, fluid will flow, won't it?
Not necessarily.
Why not?
Well, the 1 millidarcy is a standard conditional cutoff for oil fluid flow. And so anything below that is probably more than likely going to be a barrier to fluid flow.
We'll take that in 2 pieces. Let's just start first with the one that you just offered here. That, so that the commissioners aren't misled, that would be in a conventional mobile oil type environment, yes?
Correct.
Yeah, and so if we're looking below so you said you set your baffle flag at 7% porosity based on actual measured core data. If we use the 1, you can tell the commissioners that there's piles of plots here that have over 1 millidarcy of permeability measured at less than 7% porosity. True?
Correct.
And according to you, over 1 millidarcy, we should all be expecting fluid to flow at that permeability, right?
Yes, in a horizontal perspective.
What if we add CO2 and we're no longer speaking in a conventional world? You understand this whole proceeding that we're at week 3 of this is over Empire going in with CO2.
Correct.
Okay. I only ask, this is being a little bit smart aleck, because we've spent a lot of time talking about mobile oil in a conventional world. And in terms of mobile oil, you understand Empire's not expecting to get mobile oil in the San Andres. We're on the same page with that?
Correct.
Okay. If you apply CO2, the 1 millidarcy of permeability that you spoke to in a conventional world, that comes down significantly, doesn't it?
Correct.
How far down would that come?
I do not know.
Would 0.1 at least be a reasonable estimate?
0.1 for a gas reservoir would be about what Dr. Davidson assumed was a 7% porosity cutoff.
I'm talking about permeability now. I'm sorry, we may have missed. If you're adding CO2, can you now expect fluid to flow at 0.1 millidarcy of permeability?
Gas to flow at 0.1 millidarcy.
At what point would you have oil flow?
Somewhere between less than 1 millidarcy, I would assume, if it's got a gas component.
How about water?
Water, probably around that 1 millidarcy, plus or minus.
Have you done that work, or
No.
You're guessing at this?
No, I am making a professional judgment.
Okay. But just as we put this plot into perspective, you would set your baffle flag. You did set your baffle flag over here at 7% porosity. And so now I'm asking, in a CO2 world, you talked about 1, and I showed you where we've got plotted core in 4 different cores in the San Andres that, and Grayburg, that have plots that are well over 1. If we add CO2, we get even more of these data points that would then fall into to fluid that potentially moves.
Some mobility, yes.
With respect to permeability barriers, if we come back to your, and what I'm trying to figure out is, were you here during the opening remarks by Mr. Rankin? When the very first day, we came in on Thursday and there was opening argument. Do you remember that? No?
I probably don't remember it specifically, but I think it was here.
Okay, you were here, yeah. And Mr. Rankin said that his experts were not given any guidance on where the analysis was supposed to end up or where the conclusions were to lie. He wanted them to come and make an objective assessment. Do you remember him mentioning that in opening arguments one way or the other?
To that effect, I would assume that was.
I want to look back at your original report. Do you see I've published, I think this is the one before the correction, and this is no gotcha with the correction or not. But this was the very first one you signed. And I'm gonna publish this. All right. Can you read that? Do I need to? What was the second charge that you were given as part of your work here? Can you read number 2 to the commissioners?
Evaluate and confirm the presence of geologic barriers isolating the San Andreas Formation from the overlying Grayberg Formation. Why were you not engaged to just evaluate the potential presence of barriers? Why were you engaged to actually confirm the presence of geologic barriers? That is what it states there, but my analysis, if it did not find barriers, that would have been my analysis.
Is the reason that you were retained to confirm the presence of barriers that Goodnight had already drilled and was injecting salt water into Empire's oil unit?
Could you rephrase that?
Yeah, I mean, at the time that you were hired to confirm barriers, was the reason they were asking you to confirm as opposed to evaluate whether they exist at all because they were already injecting into the oil unit?
At the time, I did not know. And although it does say confirm the presence of geologic barriers, I interpreted that to be confirm or unconfirm or deny.
So can you tell the commissioners about an instance in which you would have been hired before this to confirm geologic barriers?
No.
So if the commissioners want to know how often you go around as a Netherlands soil expert confirming the presence of geologic barriers, this would have been the first time you were hired to do that.
It was the first time there was something written that said that in a bullet point, but confirming permeability barriers is basically what I do for a living. Determining net pay and what is a barrier, what is a reservoir, what is non-reservoir, what is quality of rock, what is poor quality of rock, what is reasonable quality of rock.
So just coming back here to confirming the presence of these baffles in your reports, and I can show you examples, but you use the phrase potential barriers to flow. You know that you have hedging language throughout these reports that do not say Netherlands Soil is saying there is in fact a barrier. It says that there might potentially be a barrier.
Correct.
Is that the testimony of Netherlands Soil in this case today?
Objection. Netherlands Soil is not testifying. Mr. Knights is testifying.
Well, he's an agent. I'll allow it. Overruled.
Okay, could you repeat the question?
And I'm just trying to see if you're sticking with the reports or if we need another revision. Is it the testimony of Netherlands Soil through you as its agent that there is a potential barrier?
Yes.
Is it the testimony of you as Netherlands Soil's agent that there is in fact a barrier?
There are many barriers between the 350 and 700 feet that I kind of evaluated.
Is it the testimony of Netherlands Soil through you as in Netherlands Soil is the entity actually engaged here as the work, right?
Correct.
Is it the testimony of Netherlands Sewell that there is in fact across the entirety of the EMSU an impermeable barrier that prohibits the flow of any fluid from the San Andreas into the Grayburg? Yes or no?
Could you repeat that again?
Yes, sir.
I got to get all these
Yeah, no, that's okay.
caveats.
Yeah, the goal is to get this as accurate as possible, and I appreciate you asking me to break it down and clarify. I'll strike that. As we visit concretely here on this project, let me start with the first question. Is it the testimony of Netherlands Sewell, through you as its agent, that there is a potential barrier to flow between the lower San Andreas and the Grayburg?
Yes,
Objection
correct.
form.
Oops, sorry.
Overruled.
Is it the testimony of you and Netherlands Sewell here to this New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission that there is in fact an impermeable barrier all the way across the EMSU that prohibits the flow of fluid from the San Andreas into the Grayburg? Yes or no?
Objection foundation. He's talking about formation nomenclature that Mr. Knights did not address in his testimony. So I think the question needs to be specified so he understands the question.
Overruled.
With the caveat, can I put a caveat in? Yes or no, or say it's gray? I don't know.
Is it gray?
Well, the specific statement you made is there a barrier, one barrier across the entire EMSU? And I would say there is, I have not identified one single barrier, but many individual barriers.
With respect to what you're saying, many individual barriers, is it the testimony of you for Netherlands Sewell here to this New Mexico Oil Conservation Commission that taking the many barriers that they prohibit, that it is an impermeable barrier that does in fact prohibit any fluid migration from the San Andreas into the Grayburg?
I would say significantly inhibits.
Can you help me with the difference between significantly inhibits and completely stops?
I am not 100% sure, but the preponderance of evidence that I've reviewed indicates that there is more likely strong indications of permeability barrier between fluid flow from the Goodnight injection zones and the Empire shallow production and the shallower potential ROZ.
I'd object to the non-responsive and ask that be stricken. And this is to the ends of, I'm not going to fuss with him or fight over him on decorum, but I do need answers to the specific question I'm asking.
Well, re-ask it then. I'm not going to strike the answer.
The question is, if you focus on, what is the difference between significantly inhibits and completely stops?
The degree of certainty.
That you're saying that is a degree of certainty is what differentiates those two things?
Yes.
Have you opined anywhere on a degree of certainty as to significantly inhibits?
No.
And if Mr. Rankin comes back after the break, you're not going to be able to put a percentage on that, are you?
No.
Now, as a geologist, I thought I heard Mr. Rankin's objection a moment ago that you don't know where the San Andreas is. You didn't pick any tops of the San Andreas, did you?
No.
Well, I don't, what, you're laughing. Help me with that. Why are you laughing on a question when we've got 21 witnesses in this thing? And the commission's got to make a decision. And I asked the geologist, did you pick the top of the San Andreas? And you laughed. Help me with why that one's a funny one.
You have a number of geologists picking the top of the San Andreas at various places. You didn't need another one to put in another estimate on there. The problem with the San Andreas, it's just not a defined interval. So it's basically to the whims of whoever's picking it for whatever reason they're picking it, where they are picking it. And I didn't want to get into that quagmire.
Well, maybe we are going to get to that person, but we've deposed everything that moves and I haven't seen it yet. Who is the Goodnight witness that is going to get on the stand and tell the commission that they picked the top of the San Andreas?
I would assume that would be Preston McGuire,
Did he
I
pick,
think.
did he pick them or did he rely on hearsay from someone that is no longer with the company?
I do not know. Again, I tried to stay away from that.
Do you know where the Lovington Sand is?
I never really looked for it. The nomenclature was new to me.
In terms of if the commissioners want to know where the top of the San Andreas is, strike that. If the commissioners want to know, according to Mr. Knights, where is the upper San Andreas? Is that any analysis you've performed? Could you tell them where the upper San Andreas is?
No.
If they wanted to know where the lower San Andreas is, as the geologist here, could you tell them where the lower San Andreas is?
No.
If they wanted to know where the Lovington Sand is, you couldn't tell them where the Lovington Sand is.
No.
Now, in terms of as we continue this barriers to flow, if we saw at number 2 here in your report that your task was to confirm the presence of geologic barriers isolating the San Andreas Formation from the overlying Grayburg Formation. I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
You heard your counsel's objection earlier that you didn't know where the San Andreas was, right?
Correct.
So how did you confirm the presence of geologic barriers isolating the San Andreas Formation from the overlying Grayburg Formation? If you didn't even pick the tops, you don't know where it is, you don't know where the Lovington is, you don't know where upper San Andreas is or the lower San Andreas is.
I defined my own internal nomenclature.
Okay. Will you help the commissioners with what your methodology was to pick was it just the 7% porosity cutoff as you went about work here as a geologist? Was that it?
No.
What then was your methodology? Moving now, not from data, but we're moving over to methodology. What was your methodology to confirm a barrier?
Trying to look at the ponderance of data and defining where reservoirs are. And so the 2 reservoirs that I've defined that people variously call whatever name they want to are the Goodnight injection zone, which is significantly below negative 700 feet. And it was defined by permeability, fluid flow, water supply wells and injection wells that had a unique characteristic from a reservoir quality perspective. And then I had the additional information on the Grayburg reducing oil water contact that has significantly different reservoir characteristics. And then I had the petrophysical analysis that analyzed below the producing oil water contact and that negative 700, which I considered aquifer below that, and found a numerous amounts of indications of permeability barriers, horizontal permeability barriers. And I didn't see any evidence of any indication of communication between those 2 separate reservoirs. And nomenclature was not in my, I think that just confuses things.
Then why did you use it in the very first paragraph of what you wrote?
When you're first tasked for a performance, you're given all kinds of directives and people are trying to say how they view the reservoir. They viewed it as Grayburg, San Andreas. The actual unit was named Grayburg, San Andreas. I think it was ill-defined originally, and I think the definition of San Andreas, in my opinion, should have developed over the history of the FIM with the new data indicating that there are different reservoirs within the San Andreas. And much like the Grayburg has 82 separate parasequences that have different permeabilities and perm barriers between those, the San Andreas is likely having a similar set of stratigraphic barriers and reservoirs that have different qualities throughout the whole thing. And I just did not get into the what you call San Andreas, what Preston would call San Andreas, what Adam would call San Andreas, which anybody in the room would call San Andreas. I just didn't think that was important to my oil in place or the definition of reservoir isolation between one and the other.
So if we just come back to what you say your charge was, so that we've got this in one place for later in closing argument. Evaluate and confirm the presence of geologic barriers isolating the San Andreas Formation from the overlying Grayburg Formation. It would be your testimony to the commission that you don't have an opinion on that because you don't know where each of those formations are.
Objection, foundation forum.
Yes, I don't have
characterizing
an
testimony.
Overruled. And doctor, when these objections come up, you have to wait, okay?
apologize.
All right.
So no, what am I supposed to answer now? I know I was asking the question again.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I just didn't understand. I'm not fussing with you, but, and I appreciate
I
the,
don't mind.
yeah, no, I appreciate you doing that. If the commissioners want to know whether you have confirmed the presence of geologic barriers isolating the San Andreas Formation from the overlying Grayburg Formation, you would tell them that you don't have any testimony on that, do you?
It's depending on whose person interpretation of the San Andreas has specific depth intervals that are unambiguous at -700 between the producing water contact and never -350 and -700. I believe there's a number of permeability barriers potential permeability barriers that I've identified in that interval. And various geologists would call that San Andreas, Grayburg. I wanted to be very specific, and there's no ambiguity in where I picked these. I have a TBD subsea depth and an XY. It is not in the interpretation of anybody's what I'm going to call it.
You used a new phrase now. This one's actually in your report. What is a quote potential permeability barrier?
Potential is a word we use because we are not 100% sure.
And in terms of putting a probability percentage on it, we visited earlier, even if we give you a break over lunch, you're not going to be able to give us a percentage on how sure you are or not, are you?
No, it's more than likely. And the issue with geology and interpretation is you're actually interpreting every half foot for thousands and thousands of feet. So you really do have to have a preponderance of data or a most likely case, because if you're trying to be certain and 100% certain, then you almost can never make a financial decision or a decision at all if you want 100% certainty.
Well, no, I asked, what is a potential permeability barrier? You said it's something not 100% sure. I asked can you put a percentage on it? And your answer is you cannot put a percentage on it. Is that correct?
I can, but I won't.
I'll take that. And even if we take a lunch, you're not going to come in and all of a sudden have an answer all after visiting with council, are you?
Not without this. But if I go to sleep, I may have a different interpretation, as that's where I do most of my thinking.
While you're asleep?
It's amazing. I wake up in the morning and go, oh my gosh.
Okay. So as we come back to your methodology here to get to potential permeability barriers, did you review literature?
Specifically for the perm barriers, I mean, I attempted to review when people say they want literature basis. I did look, but there's very little literature on permeability barriers.
Well, with respect to the EMSU here, Dr. Lindsay has written a PhD discussing that water is migrating from the San Andreas up into the Grayburg.
Objection mischaracterizes the testimony of Dr. Lindsay and his PhD thesis.
Rephrase.
Have you read Dr. Lindsay's work on water migration from the San Andreas into the Grayburg?
First part, yes. The second part, no.
Does Dr. Lindsay opine that water is finding its way up into the Grayburg from the San Andreas?
I did not get that from reading his testimony or looking at his figures.
What about hearing his testimony here in the proceeding?
If he stated that, I would probably disagree with that interpretation.
Did you read that the Chevron paper that spoke to water migration?
Objection, foundation and form.
Overruled.
I'd have to see which specific Chevron discussion that you're talking about.
As the expert here, you can't, after we've seen the Chevron paper flash 20 times, you have no idea what Chevron paper I'm talking.
Mr. Hearing Officer, there's several Chevron papers.
I'm sorry, what was that? I heard what you said. There are several Chevron papers. All right, but in fairness to the witness, can you identify the paper you're talking about, Mr. Waymeyer?
Easier for me, any Chevron paper.
Could you rephrase the question? Any?
Do you recall seeing in this courtroom any Chevron paper in which Chevron discussed migration of fluids from the San Andres into the Grayburg?
Again, I have seen a lot of data. I'm not sure which ones were Chevron but if you could show me, I would gladly make a statement if I.
I'm actually going to move over to, what about pressure data? The 211 well with the RFT measurements that were taken in that well back against the technical committee reports, initial pressure measured up in the Grayburg. Have you done any kind of studies based on the pressure data, on pressures, to identify whether there's depletion occurring? Has occurred?
Define study. I've reviewed data and observed data and analyzed it mentally that shows that there's pressure barriers.
My question is pressure depletion in the San Andres as a result and I'm specifically talking about the RFT measurements in the 211 well, and I can show you the slide, but
I think I have the slide in my mind, but I think he said San Andres first or Grayburg.
The measurements were in the RFT tool was measured throughout the Grayburg into the San Andres. The initial pressure reading was out of the Grayburg in the technical committee report.
Again, I'm not sure who's San Andres top you're talking about, but I'm familiar with the depths and the pressure variations that indicated permeability barriers between them.
Trying to get to share. This is a slide that you're familiar with. Have you looked?
Yeah, I've seen that.
All right. Yeah. So here we go. So in the 211 well, all of the little bullseyes, those were measurements off of the RFT tool in 1986, which would go down into the San Andres, correct?
By someone's definition of San Andres, yes.
And do you see that there is a 282 PSI depletion that's reflected here off of what would be anticipated pressure off of the technical committee report original pressure reading?
The initial pressure reading in the San Andres?
In the Grayburg.
I'm confused.
Yep.
That pressure, that 1527 is by this in San Andres.
That would have been predicted in terms of where it should have been based on the pressure gradients.
Predicted from, do you know what the pressure gradient was in the San Andres at 3,700 feet? I can't ask questions.
No, that's
Inappropriate. I'm just kind of
I'm just trying to figure out with your work here, is y'all, if you're talking about barriers, did you do any of your own engineering, any of your own geological work here or engineering work to look at pressure depletion, to see if there's pressure depletion between the Grayburg and the San Andres? Yes or no?
Don't think I had any pressure data in what some people call the San Andres.
We were talking about literature. Have you seen any literature that says there's an impermeable barrier across the EMSU that would isolate the San Andres from the Grayburg?
Literature that says specifically perm barriers across the entire EMSU, no.
Okay, so if the commission wanted to know after 100 years of oil and gas development out here, whether anybody has written that there is a potential permeability barrier across the EMSU, you haven't seen that, have you?
Correct.
Have you seen any literature that would report bedded anhydrite all the way across the EMSU?
No.
If anhydrite is bedded, what does bedded mean?
It means it's a horizontal layer.
How thick does it need to be
Does it need to be for what?
to be able to call it bedded anhydrite?
I don't know, a couple inches, half foot.
And so here, if bedded anhydrite is a couple inches, again, you haven't done any kind of a fracture gradient analysis in terms of what would cause existing fractures to expand or widen or actually break through that rock, have you?
No.
If fluid does migrate from the San Andres, the Goodnight's injecting, you with me so far?
Yes.
If the
assumption.
If the potential baffle doesn't keep that water down there, you with me so far?
If, yes.
Yeah. Would you agree that that would interfere with Empire's oil and gas operations in the Grayburg?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
What interfere? What does that mean?
Make more expensive, cause the loss of oil, cause less oil to be recovered? Where's the answer? I don't know.
I don't know.
And the reason I asked that is because council asked you remember like the last three questions he had of you was about whether Goodnight's operations are having an effect on Empire, right?
True.
In terms of evaluating, I'm going to step sideways here for just a second. In terms of evaluating an ROZ project, you said you've been involved as a consultant assisting clients in evaluating an ROZ project?
Yes.
And if we come here to the EMSU and we hypothetically play out that Empire approaches you to ask you about an ROZ in the San Andres, you with me so far?
Which San Andres?
All of the San Andres formation. Let's do the entire San Andres that's in the unit that the commission formed in 1984. Then are we on the same page?
I think so, but yeah.
Sure. You know that right this second, Goodnight is injecting into Empire's earlier established oil unit, right?
I know the depths that they're injecting into.
Are you familiar with any other instance? Have you ever seen that in your career where a commercial saltwater disposal operator is injecting into somebody's designated unit?
Not that I'm familiar with now.
This would be the first one
that I have seen.
Yeah. So coming back to this, if Empire approaches you and says, I'm looking at an ROZ development, maybe it costs $1.2 billion and I'm going to do the entire San Andres. You with me so far?
Think so, yes.
And I'm not, and that's not a hypothetical in terms that you heard Mr. West actually sit up here and testify that their intention is to go Empire's intention, Phil Mulisek, they do everything big. They're going to go all the way down to the bottom of to the top of the Glorietta. Did you hear Mr. West's testimony?
I heard that.
Okay. Would you tell them this is a concern that there is vast amounts of salt water being injected into the interval that you want to conduct your tertiary operation in?
So would that be a concern of mine
Yes.
to them?
Yes.
No,
Why?
because if the alleged resource is in the St. Andrews and it is residual, it's not going to be moved by injection of fluid.
Isn't it going to make a CO2 program different? Injecting that fluid is going to change pressures. It's going to cause more expensive use of CO2. Once oil becomes mobile after the CO2 invades those pore spaces, it can be washed out of the recovery wells. All of these are potential lost hydrocarbons in this hypothetical, aren't they?
I would assume that might be an impact.
And so again, coming back to your advice to Empire who approaches you in light of this saltwater injection, you can tell this commission that any investor, be it a bank that's, and you represent banks making decisions on whether to lend, right?
Yes.
Operators making decisions on whether to drill,
Yes.
working interest owners making decisions on over whether to elect to participate on a AFE to participate in a project.
Correct.
You are absolutely going to tell them that this saltwater injection is a concern, aren't you?
Don't know really.
Now, in terms of the baffles, were you able to map a single baffle that went all the way across the EMSU? Were you able to correlate that in your logs? A baffle that you could, if you start at 2 inches over here and you can follow it all the way over?
I did not map.
And that's actually a question in and of itself. I didn't find a single map you created in this entire case. Did you create one single map as any of it through 3 statements? 2 of them you revised and a deposition, and you being a geologist, is there one map you actually made here?
Well, the maps in my presentation were basically data posted at individual wells, but I did not contour a map around the EMSU.
I know you took Ops Geologics maps and contours, right? Yep.
Yes. Yes, I reviewed.
Other than just adding some numbers to maps that other geologists made, you didn't make a single map here, did you?
Correct.
And I'm not, this is truly not a smart aleck question, but don't geologists like love creating maps? Isn't like the first thing you're doing is you're looking at the actual core and you're making maps?
Yeah. Well, in the due diligence process, making maps, much like picking another St. Andrews tops, kind of confuses the issue. I have enough maps and things to basically do diligence on and see if they're accurate, see if they make sense, and use their information. Because a lot of times when I'm reviewing something, the other people have spent a lot more time looking at the environment and geologists. And basically, I just want to confirm, validate, and use whatever data I can from other experts.
So the other experts here, you said they spend a lot more time doing the evaluation?
Correct.
You didn't rely on any of Dr. Davidson's maps, did you?
I don't know if he made maps.
I didn't see one. So stated differently, you're not aware of a single map that Netherlands Sewell made here, are you?
Correct.
And so if we just come back to the work, you like to rely on all the other work because they've done more work. That was your testimony a moment ago.
Correct.
Here, that would be New Tech and Ops Geologic, wouldn't it be?
That was data that I reviewed from a validation standpoint. Yes.
Now, as we continue to talk about the mapping, you were not able to map. Did you even try to map a particular baffle that would have gone across the EMSU, whether it's 2 inches thick or 400 feet thick?
No, I did not.
And you can tell the commission, though, based on looking at these logs, there is not going to be one single baffle that goes all the way across, is there?
I cannot say there's not.
After all of your work here, if there was one to be found, do you think your work would have found that baffle?
Not necessarily.
So I guess just,
I'm trying to answer it.
no, I'm sure, I appreciate your cooperation, that none of this is a fuss with you. I'm just trying to get my head around how, if you're the barrier guy, and you're the geologist and you have all of these logs and we're talking about baffles or barriers, if there was one, why you didn't map it to bring it in here and show the commissioners?
Why I didn't map it? I guess the number of logs and the data that we have, even if we could map it between the points, there would be a lot of extrapolation and where you don't have data or don't have quality data to actually have a high degree of confidence in the data.
So basically what you're saying is, if you were going to try to map a baffle or a barrier that would go all the way across, there's too much uncertainty in your data to be able to do that and come in here and give an opinion to these commissioners.
For a single barrier, yes.
Now, help me if I'm understanding your report correctly. I didn't see that you really tied this back to logs or core at all in terms of the idea of a baffle or a barrier. It looked to me like you left geology and went to engineering and said that you observed mud losses. Is that fair?
That's probably fair.
Okay, so if the commission wants to know on this baffle or barrier testimony, is this geology or is this like what you said in your report? Really what I saw documented were mud losses, and so that's where my opinion lands. It would be fair to say this is more of an engineering mud loss type opinion for these commissioners.
Yeah, integrated the geology and the engineering came to my professional opinion. May I approach to just show a demonstrative?
Approach the witness.
I'm trying to honor decorum. I'm just trying, before I leave my place at bar, I want to make sure I have permission to go get that board.
Yeah, sure. No, that's fine. You need to move Mr. Rankin to see what Mr. Waymire is pointing out. Feel free to do so.
So I'm just going to kind of lay out what we've got. This purple, can you see the black? You see the black line?
Mr. Whitmire, maybe helpful if you just let me know what images we're looking at so I can understand what they are.
This is across the, what do we got? We've got the SWD wells on here, and we have numerous of the other deeper wells, that conventional wells that have been drilled. And what we've got is a mapped by osteologic top of the lower St. Andrews. That's going to be black. I'm sorry, let me get my key here. Oh, sorry.
Why'd you speak?
Let me make sure I don't mess up. All right. We've got purple. They've mapped in the purple the mud losses, because we've heard all about the mud losses is how we know this is happening, right? You've heard that in here, and we've read that 1,000 times, right?
Correct.
Purple is the mud losses in the various wells that have been reported. Red is osteologic's top of the St. Andrews. And there, this brown is Lovington sand. Black is the lower St. Andrews. And so are we oriented now in terms of, I think really maybe the easiest way is if you focus in on purple being those mud losses and the red being ops geologic's top of St. Andrews. And blue, we've also placed on here in blue, Goodnights, what Preston McGuire got from somebody else. Blue is, it would be the Goodnight top of St. Andrews.
Okay.
You with me so far? Have you tried to like actually correlate this as we talk about, well, it's explained by the loss of mud during drilling. Have you tried to map where the loss of mud happened in relation to anybody's top of St. Andrews?
No, just TBD subsea, absolute value.
And you can tell the commissioners here that if purple is the loss of the drilling mud fluid, that is all over. There is zero correlation between where fluid was lost in anybody, the Lovington Sand, the top of the San Andreas, either side's top of St. Andrews. I mean, if you've got opinions about mud losses having some relevance here, can you explain to the commission how that is based on the actual data?
Why there's mud loss?
Yes. How does the mud loss, with the variable depths that is happening, telling the commission anything about whether there's communication between the San Andreas and the Graper?
Again, the tops San Andreas Grayburg, I think between -350 and -700, I've got significant indications of multiple permeability barriers that may not individually go across the entire EMSU, but individual reservoirs, even in the lost circulation, can be stratigraphically isolated.
They might be stratigraphically isolated, or there might not be, right?
Sure.
And with respect to stratigraphic isolation, you've heard testimony about the baffles. You're not disputing as a matter of geology that there can be baffles within that might change pressures in isolated intervals, but that wouldn't extend all the way across the EMSU, are you?
That wouldn't?
Correct.
Could you state that again? I'm not sure.
You're not disputing that in a particular well, there can be isolated areas of baffles that would not be extensive across the entire 14,000 acre EMSU.
Yes, that could be correct.
And again, I've heard so much about the mud. I told the guy, I said, I got to see it on one plate. Just show me where's the mud happening against these tops so that I can get my head around this. Can you explain to the commissioners, if they go back and read your witness statements and it says, I have opinions about potential barrier, flow barriers based on where mud was lost, by reference to this correlation or comparison across the log section, can you show them how that testimony is supported?
How it is. Yeah, I'm a little confused on the question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and on some days I'm an okay lawyer. I'm a terrible geologist and engineer. I can tell you that. Help me if I'm just asking the bad question and you ask it differently. But if the idea of your battles are explained as a matter of engineering, which is what we just covered before I stood up here, I said, if it's geology, let's see its map. You said, I don't have that. I said, is it really more engineering? You said, yes, it's the mud losses. I'm showing you the mud losses. I'm showing you what someone at Goodnight at some point in time called top of St. Andrews, what Ops Geologic has not mapped at the top of St. Andrews. And I've even put the lower St. Andrews on here too. And I've even given you the Lovington Sand. Can you tell the commissioners in your own testimony, how on earth does this support the idea that there is an impermeable barrier across the EMSU that would isolate injection from the Graper?
Yeah, one specific. I'm not sure.
This would be a good place to break for lunch.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Mr. Whitmire, I can't see it from where I'm sitting. And Ms. Hardy, maybe perhaps you guys can send us a copy of what we're looking at, because I just can't tell what we're looking at from this distance. And I wouldn't mind being able to look at it so I can prepare for a redirect.
Sure. And I should have pointed this out. If this helps, A is over here on the very far, so that there's no cherry picking. A is on the very far western edge. A minus is over here at the southeast, and we have some data points way out here east. And so as you track these, I will send the answer key, the legend.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I'm not asking for Mr. Waymire to testify. I'm just asking for him to share the document with me so I can see it.
Well, why don't you guys do that over lunch? Chairman Rosato, so what time is your pleasure for the commission to be back?
Let's return back at 1:15. I think it'll be a perfect time, and it'll give him some time to also exchange information.
Okay, that's great. All right, folks, we'll break for lunch and be back at 1:15. Thank you.